Okay, Mr. Farage, thank you for joining us. It was about this time last year that you were elected as leader, so you've had a year in the job. How's it gone?
I can't pretend it's been easy. What party leader could say that it had? No, I mean, the biggest problem we've had this year has been our case with the Electoral Commission, and how topical that is now, given the Labour Party's difficulties. We had a problem that our biggest donor in the year 2005 omitted to send back his electoral registration document. And whilst this legislation was there to stop foreign and anonymous donors, this retired bookmaker is most certainly not foreign, certainly isn't anonymous, but he wasn't a permissible donor for that period. So we've been embroiled in a court case where the government wants to forfeit from us £250,000. And that, I'm afraid, has taken up far too much energy.
What do you think the solution is to the political funding crisis at the moment, and what would UKIP do about it?
Let me tell you one thing, it is not state funding. We are the only party who are opposed to the taxpayer bailing out the political parties and keeping them on life support for the next few years. And I'll tell you why. I've seen this at first hand in France, in Belgium, and in Italy. 3 countries where the state funds politics. Is politics less corrupt in those 3 countries with state funding? Well, I'll leave the viewer to make their own minds up on that. I don't believe it's the right answer. Of course we need transparency. Of course we don't want Colombian drugs money deciding who wins the next election. But the one thing that I do quite like the idea of is the idea that if individuals give donations, then perhaps there'll be some form of match funding from taxpayers' money. That's the only exception I would give. But just to give parties millions of pounds a year because they got X number of votes at the last general election is not the answer.
Okay. Just talk to you about the electoral results of 2006. Start again. Just talk to you about the electoral results of 2007. You had high hopes. I think you fielded over 1,000 candidates this year, but you didn't do so well. Why do you think that was?
Did we do well? Did we do badly? I mean, it's tough to judge. You know, first past the post politics is damn difficult for a party like UKIP, and there's no question about that. Because the argument always is, well, of course, you know, you're not going to win, therefore we're not going to vote for you. And you finish up with those people voting for you that would vote for you in blood, but lots of other people who agree with you but don't vote for you because they don't think you can win. So, you know, I can't pretend that electorally it's been fantastic. It hasn't. What we have proved in the past is that it is in elections such as the European elections, where there's no such thing as a wasted vote, where we can produce results that absolutely stun people. But I would say against that, you know, what we'd achieved this year is we have begun to develop a full manifesto for how we think an independent Britain could and should be run. And I think some of that policy development in areas such as education, defence, is becoming ever more relevant. And you'll see UKIP appearing in the press, appearing on the radio, on a much wider range of issues than just that of the European Union. And that perhaps has been our biggest success this year.
Well, I'm keen to talk to you about the expansion of UKIP's policies, but in an interview with the UKIP leader, it would be a shame not to bring up Europe. So what do you say to people who say that Europe is the world's biggest market, it's the largest exporter, the biggest aid donor, and the largest foreign investor? It's brought peace and stability and democracy to over 25 countries, and arguably is the most successful example of human collaboration in the world. Why do we want out of it?
Well, I'd say wake up and smell the coffee. You know, to say that it's this huge success is really quite bizarre. It's brought peace, has it? I thought NATO had done that. I thought that was our guarantor. I thought that was the thing that made sure since 1945 that we actually had peace, where sovereign states agree to cooperate together. Something UKIP believes in 100%. We support international cooperation. We enthuse about it. What we don't support is a system whereby, rather than cooperating, we actually give away the ability to make decisions, and someone at the centre assimilates that power. So they're 2 entirely different things. Now, on the economics of it, here, I think our arguments are now so obvious and so plain that really what we're fighting against is this ludicrous idea. Blair started it. Oh, well, 3 million British jobs depend on being in the EU. The world's biggest market. Do you know there are 500 million people in the European Union? Do you know there are 1.9 billion that live within the Commonwealth? I mean, compare the European market to the potential of the Commonwealth, and it's absolutely tiny. In terms of growth, in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms particularly of research and development, we're now in a situation where the EU is now almost an entire generation behind the United States of America. And that gap, that gulf is getting bigger every year because we have a regulatory model that actually puts off innovation and fresh investment. The European Union this year will have 18% of the world's GDP. It is estimated that by 2020, it'll be 10% of GDP. So if you were a British business looking to the future, looking to be prosperous, looking to trade, looking to do business, where would you see the biggest marketplace? Romania, Bulgaria, countries like that that are part of the EU, or India and China? I think I know the answer.
I noticed that you are planning to change the name of the United Kingdom Independence Party to, I believe it's the Independence Party, and that comes up in February. Presumably this is part of your effort to make the party have a wider appeal on different issues, but what difference does a name change really have?
Well, you know, rebranding is a very contentious issue, and I'm sure that most of my members would say it was a dreadful, I shouldn't even be considering it. You know, we must keep everything as it is. The point about rebranding is that we always think of rebranding in terms of consignia, which was a complete and total disaster. But actually out there, through the commercial world and political world, there are parties, there are companies that have changed, that have rebranded and become very successful as a result of doing so. I would say this: I think that UKIP has established itself as a credible voice at being negative. We're known for being negative. Oh, yeah, they're the mob that keep telling us how dreadful everything from Europe is. Of course, they're right, but essentially, we've come across as being a party of negatives. We've come across as a party appealing perhaps to disgusted of Tunbridge Wells. Now, I know there's a young generation out there that would agree with the comments I've just made on globalisation, that would agree that far from being this huge, exciting marketplace, it's just a little local backyard. And to appeal to people like that, to get them on board, we've got to stop telling people what's wrong with everything and start to offer some solutions. So I want us to turn this around to be a very positive party, and we do, and that's where the bigger, broader manifesto fits in. It's by showing people how we would run things if 75% of our laws weren't made by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, that I think we move forward. As far as the name itself is concerned, well, you know, UKIP, it's just called UKIP, isn't it? I mean, that's what everybody writes about it as and talks about it as. It's so well known that, frankly, it's difficult to change. I would like to change the emphasis, and I would like it to be known more often colloquially as the Independence Party, but in terms of officially changing the name, I have to say, I've floated the idea, I've played around with it, I don't really think it's going to happen.
Very honest. Just a couple more questions. You live locally, and in UKIP's, the Independence Party's effort to broaden its appeal, you presumably are looking at a whole load of different areas, as you said, education and so on. I was just wondering what you think the solution to the housing shortages in this part of the world and the problem that young people have with getting onto the housing ladder, and what UKIP's answer to that problem is.
Well, you know, governments can't always give answers to everything. And it's quite a false assumption and mistake to think that somehow governments can solve everything. They can't. What governments can do through policy is to influence economic conditions, whether economic conditions are good or bad. But governments can't do an awful lot more than that. However, when it comes to housing, we're not actually facing up to the reason why we have such massive demand for housing at the lower end of the market. And the reason, of course, is immigration. Now, I know we're not supposed to talk about this because in polite society, this is all too difficult. But the fact is that the British population has been through a massive surge over the course of the last 3 years, generally from people who are looking to rent initially and then perhaps buy at the bottom end of the market. And that is what has kept house prices at that end of the market up. And even if we have a fall in the £1.5 million houses next year, and I suspect we might, given the interest rates and the general state of the economy, my feeling is the bottom end of the market is going to hold up. So that's one thing that we ought to be addressing, that if we didn't have an open door to so many people from Eastern Europe, those pressures would not be as great. Clearly, we're going to need to build more houses. That's not, take immigration out of it, but look at the way we live. We're living in smaller family units. People don't live, the husband and wife, the kids and the grandparents all together in one house. Family breakdown. There are more people living alone. And clearly there is an absolute need for more housing, but it's just a question of how you do it. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows quite how to address this. There are lots of ideas have been tried, particularly in market towns and rural areas, of building local properties for local people. The theory of that is very good. In practice, it doesn't always work. So I have to say that in the end, the housing situation will be sorted out by the market and not by government. But if we weren't so irresponsibly building up our population every year, that pressure wouldn't be as bad.
Final question. You stood in the Bromley by-election as a candidate where you pushed Labour into fourth place.
That's right.
Do you have plans to stand again for Parliament? And what are your plans for the future of UKIP as you move forward?
Well, the important thing is not where I stand at this stage. The important thing is that we get our planning and our logistics right for the European elections. They're not too far away. They're likely to come shortly after the ratification of a treaty through Parliament without a referendum, which is going to make people pretty angry and gives us a big opportunity. On the general election scheme, what we're doing is we're adopting candidates, PPCs, up and down the country much earlier than we've ever done for a general election before, and we will go into that general election with 500 candidates fighting on a positive manifesto. And that's what we're about. You know, we're not a pressure group, we're a political party. And we recognise that by taking votes from other parties and by posing a threat, people actually start to listen.
Do you think, just as a follow-up to that, do you think there's a potential pact with the Conservatives to make sure that you don't compete with each other in parliamentary seats?
Well, as a former Conservative member and activist, I have to say that under Call Me Dave's leadership, this sort of transformation of the Conservative Party into the Blue Labour Party, I've never felt further away from them and what they stand for ever. So I just don't see that happening. What I do see happening is UKIP being reasonable and sensible, and where we've got sitting members of Parliament, be they Tory or Labour, who espouse the same values that we espouse, then we certainly won't be fighting against them. So there are some issues that matter a lot more than your tribal allegiance to a party. And we've said to those sitting MPs, if you're campaigning for an independent Britain, we're with you. But I'm afraid that well over 90% of the people that represent us now in the House of Commons are nothing other than professional, careerist politicians. They care far more about their own re-election than they do about the country or their constituents' views.
Okay. I think that's
all right.
Great. That's great for that
Brilliant.
part.
Good.
Wait, no, you can't go yet.
Right.
I'm rolling, ready when you are.
Okay. So, Mr. Farage, you're here to speak at a UKIP event here in Salisbury, the title of which is "Why Must We Have a Referendum?" Why must we have a referendum?
Because we were promised one. It's as simple as that. It was in the government's manifesto that we'd get a referendum on the European Constitution. Now, of course, I know they've dropped the word constitution, but when you think that this document, this new Lisbon Treaty, is 96% the same as the Constitution that was kicked into the long grass by the French and the Dutch, from every aspect, we ought to be given a referendum. And if we're not, then politics, which I think has fallen into contempt to a very large degree over the last 15, 20 years, will fall yet further into contempt. That's the main reason. We can talk about content as well, and we can talk about the fact that this treaty actually makes the European Union a legal entity in its own right, and it gives it the ability, without ever again having to have an intergovernmental conference or another treaty, to amend itself and take more powers. So there is that element too, but to me, the government gave us a promise, they should honour it.
Now, does UKIP propose a referendum on the treaty or a referendum on being in the EU itself?
Listen, I am one of 27 million voters under the age of 50 who's never been asked. I'd be happy with a referendum on anything. Please give us an opportunity to express an opinion. We're asking for a referendum on this treaty. But what I'll be saying to the meeting is that if Brown is forced into conceding a referendum, I doubt he'll ever give us a referendum on this treaty, because he knows that a referendum on the transfer of further powers would get rejected massively in this country. If he's forced into having a referendum, I think it'll be on the in or out question. And my message on that is, if that's the case, then we're ready to fight it.
There are other political parties who are saying something similar to that. And so where does UKIP... Sorry, I'll start again. There are other political parties that are saying something similar to you on that. So where is UKIP different to those other parties?
Well, no. I mean, the Conservatives are acting as an opposition party, which in itself is a rarity. But they are saying, there should be a referendum on this treaty. Well, fine. But of course, the one thing they can't countenance is a referendum on the in or out question, knowing it would absolutely split them from top to bottom. The Labour Party just want to deny us a say. But the villains of the piece are the Liberal Democrats, because they too had a manifesto commitment to giving us a referendum on this treaty, and they've now said they're going to vote with the government against an amendment to give us a referendum. And I just wish that people would wake up to the fact that of all the parties in Britain today, it is the Liberal Democrats who are absolute EU fanatics. They'd like our whole lives controlled from Brussels. They'd like Westminster devalued even more than it has been, and they're being utterly dishonest.
To answer your question about the EU constitution itself, not the Lisbon Treaty, was this not a better deal? If we're going to have a treaty, would it not have been better to have a constitution, because it simplified a large number of treaties into a single one, whereas this reform treaty is just another treaty that governs our lives?
No, I mean, I think that if you look at the comparison between the idea of one document and a constitution, and I accept the dog's dinner that we're going to have, it's about content, not style. You've talked about style in your question, but the content is exactly the same with what we've got as it was in the Constitution. But don't take my word for it. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was the architect of this, has said how happy he is that all the main provisions have been maintained. And that's really what matters. And that's why, when Brown tells us that somehow this is different to the Constitution, it just won't wash.
UKIP's had a long-standing policy of, UKIP's had a long-standing policy of drawing back powers from the EU and giving Britain back power. But this treaty gives us an opt-out on asylum, visas, immigration, justice and home affairs.
Sorry, you're completely wrong there. They're actually opt-ins. They're opt-ins. They're not opt-outs, they're opt-ins. They're opt-ins. They say that whilst we're not subject to the legislation for now, we can at any point in the future, without an intergovernmental conference, without a big debate, just say, yeah, that's fine, we'll have all of that. And as far as the Justice and Home Affairs area is concerned, you only have to look at what the House of Commons Scrutiny Committee have said. They've said that these safeguards, these red lines, won't hold. In fact, to quote Michael Connaughton, the chairman of that committee, the whole thing will leak like a sieve, so it just isn't going to work. And after a short 5-year period, it is doubtful whether we'll be able to hold out against any of those provisions. And I would just remind people, when we're talking justice and home affairs, what we're actually talking about is your right to trial by jury. What we're talking about is habeas corpus, the state not being able to chuck you in a cell for 6 months before bringing a charge. What we're talking about is the presumption of innocence before guilt. What we're talking about is the entire British legal system, which, despite the fact it has its flaws and has its faults, is without doubt, as far as I'm concerned, the best form of protection the individual has against the state anywhere in the world, and that should not be up for grabs.
Okay, I think we're about there.
It's a passionate end.
Am I in the way?
No, you're fine. You're fine. Is the handbag
So you come up from Southampton. You live in the New Forest, is that right?
No, I don't. No. I'm living in Kent actually, but I've had a very complicated day because I've been here. I've been at the school today, Bishop Wordsworth, and then I got involved in the sperm donor round. Quite why I'm an expert on that, I don't know, but. No, the reason is I've been a big-time critic of the CSA for a long time. And this guy, who did this thing with these lesbian girls, and then 5 years later they wanted to start paying maintenance. The stunning thing is that even before a paternity test had been conducted, the CSA were taking £500 a month out of his bank account. Now, I'm saying this is just monstrous.
It's outrageous.
That you just don't give civil servants that amount of power. Better to have a court, family division.
Would you support through the courts, a system through the courts?
Yeah, I would. And do you know why? Because what the court system used to have was a child advocate. And the advocate would advise the court what he or she thought was in the best interest of the child. And the judge was charged to make a decision, as far as settlements were concerned, that put the child first. There's absolutely no guarantee that the CSA are operating on where we are.
We're just getting a two-shot.
So
I need to
that's
stop
how I've got involved in it, But it kind of says, I think the fact that I've been involved in it says quite a lot about UKIP in a way. You know, whilst we do want to get independent countries,
It would be
we
nice.
also want less government, a better government.
I mean, we're talking almost not libertarian.
Liberal. Old-fashioned
You
liberal.
would be kind of
Oh,
old-fashioned
if Gladstone was
Gladstonian
around,
liberal.
if Gladstone was around,
You would be a
I
member
would
of
be
UKIP.
in his party. Yeah, defence of the weak against the strong, free trade, all those things. No, there's a lot of UKIP that's old liberal,
Okay.
which may be why we get our biggest votes in Devon and Cornwall.